A 25-year-old ruler stands atop a mountain of corpses he created, watching vultures feast on the remains of an entire civilization. This is not a scene from a horror movie. This is the moment that would transform the most powerful emperor in ancient history, from humanity's greatest killer into its most devoted champion of peace. Ashoka Maurya didn't start as a monster. Born into the dynasty that had expelled Alexander the Great's armies from India, he inherited an empire that stretched from Afghanistan to Bangladesh, a realm built on the simple philosophy that might makes right. His grandfather, Chandragupta, had established the Mauryan Empire through calculated brutality, and his father Bindusara had expanded it through systematic conquest. But Ashoka was different. Where his predecessors saw conquest as a business, Ashoka treated it as an art form. By 268 BCE, the young emperor had already crushed 12 rebellions, annexed 4 kingdoms, and perfected what his generals called the Mauryan method, a combination of psychological warfare and overwhelming force that broke enemy resistance before battles even began. Villages that surrendered quickly were merely enslaved. Those that resisted were erased from existence. The only territory that dared to defy this unstoppable war machine was Kalinga, a prosperous coastal kingdom in what we now call Odisha. Their crime, refusing to bow to an emperor who considered himself divinely appointed to rule the world. Kalinga's defiance wasn't just political, it was personal. Their envoys had publicly questioned Ashoka's legitimacy, suggesting that a ruler who governed only through fear was no ruler at all. For an emperor who had never faced meaningful opposition, this insult demanded a response that would echo through history. The preparation for Kalinga's destruction took 8 months. Ashoka assembled the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen. 400,000 infantry, 100,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants. This wasn't an army. It was an instrument of apocalypse designed to achieve what Ashoka called perfect conquest, the complete elimination of a people's will to resist. The strategy was methodical in its cruelty. Instead of targeting Kalinga's capital directly, Ashoka ordered a systematic campaign of terror that would work inward from the countryside. Every village, every farm, every temple would be given a simple choice: immediate surrender or total annihilation. What Ashoka didn't anticipate was that the Kalingans had made their own choice before his armies even arrived. They had decided that death was preferable to slavery. The first phase of the campaign unfolded exactly as planned. Mauryan war elephants, fitted with iron spikes and trained to trample human beings, crushed the outer defenses. Catapults hurled incendiary devices that turned wooden fortifications into funeral pyres. Ashoka's archers, positioned in perfect formations, released clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of surrendering, the surviving Kalingans fought harder. Farmers became guerrilla fighters. Children carried messages between resistance cells. Old women prepared poisoned food for occupying troops. Every conquest became a Pyrrhic victory that cost the Mauryans dearly. This resistance enraged Ashoka beyond rational thought. He had calculated a 6-week campaign. Instead, he found himself trapped in a grinding war of attrition that dragged on for 8 months. Each day of delay was a public humiliation that undermined his authority throughout the empire. His response was escalation without limits. When the Kalingans poisoned water supplies, Ashoka ordered that prisoners be tortured to death in public. When they used civilian shields, he commanded his troops to kill everyone indiscriminately. When they retreated to sacred sites, he made the destruction of temples a military priority. The psychological toll on Ashoka's own forces was severe. Veterans who had fought in multiple campaigns began reporting nightmares and refusing direct orders. Some committed suicide rather than participate in the increasingly savage tactics their emperor demanded. But Ashoka interpreted these symptoms as weakness that needed to be purged from his military. The final battle took place on the plains outside Kalinga's capital, where the kingdom's last 60,000 defenders made their stand. They faced a Mauryan force nearly 10 times their size, but they fought with the desperation of people who had watched their entire world burn. The battle lasted 72 hours. No quarter was asked, and none was given. When the last Kalingan warrior fell, the silence that followed was so complete that Ashoka's horses refused to advance across the field of bodies. In those moments of absolute victory, surrounded by the total destruction he had orchestrated, Ashoka experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The realization that he had become exactly the kind of monster that his empire existed to fight against. The official casualty reports were clinical in their precision. 100,000 enemy dead, 150,000 deported as slaves, complete territorial annexation achieved. But standing in that field of corpses, Ashoka began to count different numbers. Families destroyed, children orphaned, futures eliminated for the sake of expanding his territory by a few hundred miles. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the world asked himself a question that would change everything. What if strength without wisdom was just another form of madness? 3 days after the massacre ended, while smoke from 1,000 funeral pyres still choked the sky, Emperor Ashoka did something no ruler had ever done before. He walked alone through the graveyard he had created, and for the first time in his life, he truly saw what his power had accomplished. The scene that greeted him was beyond anything depicted in the heroic epics that glorified warfare. This wasn't the clean death of soldiers falling honorably in battle. This was industrial-scale slaughter that had consumed an entire civilization. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. Rivers ran red with blood that attracted swarms of carrion birds. The air itself seemed poisoned with the stench of decay. But what shattered Ashoka's composure wasn't the scale of death, it was its intimacy. Among the corpses, he found scenes that would replay in his nightmares for decades. A mother who had died shielding her infant, her arms still wrapped protectively around a child who would never grow up. A grandfather clutching a scroll of poetry, his life's work reduced to blood-stained parchment. 2 young lovers who had died holding hands, their final moments spent together even as his empire tore their world apart. Each body told a story that Ashoka had never bothered to consider during his years of conquest. These weren't abstract enemies or military statistics. They were people who had loved, dreamed, hoped, and feared just as intensely as anyone in his own court. And he had erased them all for the sake of territorial expansion that would add perhaps 2% to his empire's total landmass. The moment that changed everything came when Ashoka discovered an elderly Buddhist monk named Upagupta, one of the few survivors found alive in the ruins of a monastery. The old man had lost everything, his temple, his students, his life's work. But when he saw the emperor responsible for this destruction, he didn't curse or beg or cower. Instead, he looked at Ashoka with something the emperor had never encountered before: genuine compassion for his suffering. "Your Majesty," the monk said quietly, "I grieve for the pain you must be carrying after witnessing such devastation." This response broke something fundamental in Ashoka's understanding of the world. He had expected hatred, fear, or desperate pleas for mercy. He had not expected someone who had lost everything to express concern for the emotional well-being of the person who had destroyed his life. Upagupta began explaining Buddhist concepts that Ashoka had dismissed as philosophical weakness: the interconnectedness of all living beings, the principle of ahimsa, nonviolence, and the idea that causing suffering to others inevitably creates suffering for oneself. But now, standing in the aftermath of his greatest victory, these ideas hit Ashoka with the force of divine revelation. The concept that devastated him most was karma, the understanding that every action creates consequences that eventually return to affect the actor. According to Buddhist teaching, the 100,000 people he had killed in Kalinga were just the visible portion of suffering he had created. The trauma inflicted on survivors, the children orphaned, the communities destroyed, the cycles of revenge he had initiated, all of this would generate negative karma that would pursue him through multiple lifetimes. As Upagupta spoke, Ashoka began to experience what modern psychologists would recognize as a complete psychological breakdown. Every military campaign he had ever ordered recontextualized itself in his mind as a choice between reducing or increasing the total amount of suffering in the world. And by that measure, his entire reign had been an unmitigated catastrophe. The return journey to Pataliputra, the Mauryan capital, became a nightmare procession through territories that bore the scars of his previous conquests. In city after city, Ashoka saw evidence of his empire's brutality with new eyes. The haunted expressions of conquered peoples, the empty lots where buildings had been demolished to make room for Mauryan garrisons, the children who flinched when they saw imperial soldiers. His advisors noticed dramatic changes in the emperor's behavior that they initially attributed to battlefield fatigue. Ashoka stopped eating meat, began asking detailed questions about the welfare of prisoners and slaves, and showed inexplicable interest in the living conditions of common people throughout the empire. More disturbing to the imperial court was Ashoka's growing reluctance to make military decisions. When border conflicts arose that would normally have triggered immediate retaliation, the emperor instead ordered investigations into the underlying causes of disputes. When governors requested permission to crush local rebellions, Ashoka demanded to know why people were rebelling in the first place. The transformation accelerated when Ashoka began studying Buddhist texts in earnest. The Four Noble Truths, particularly the understanding that suffering is caused by attachment and that liberation comes through compassion, provided a framework for understanding his psychological crisis. According to Buddha's teachings, his addiction to conquest and domination had been a form of spiritual illness that had corrupted not only his own soul, but the entire empire he ruled. The most profound realization came when Ashoka understood that his power, rather than making him great, had made him the primary source of unnecessary suffering in his portion of the world. Every order he issued, every policy he implemented, every war he declared had ripple effects that created pain for millions of people. His authority wasn't a divine gift, it was a responsibility that he had catastrophically misused. This insight triggered what can only be described as a spiritual emergency. For weeks, Ashoka was incapacitated by the weight of comprehending the true scope of harm he had caused. He couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on government business, and could barely function as hundreds of thousands of deaths replayed endlessly in his memory. But from this breakdown emerged a determination that was even more intense than his previous lust for conquest. If he had used his power to create unprecedented suffering, then he would dedicate the rest of his life to using that same power to reduce suffering wherever possible. The decision to convert to Buddhism wasn't just a personal spiritual choice, it was a complete reimagining of what imperial power could accomplish. Instead of conquering through force, Ashoka would attempt something that had never been tried before, transforming an empire built on violence into a state dedicated to universal compassion. His first decree as a Buddhist emperor sent shockwaves through the ancient world. There would be no more wars of conquest. The Mauryan Empire, which had been the most aggressive military force of its era, would henceforth seek to expand only through moral example and peaceful persuasion. The man who had killed 100,000 people was about to attempt the most ambitious social experiment in human history, proving that a government could be both powerful and non-violent. Imagine trying to transform the world's most brutal war machine into a government based on compassion and non-violence, without triggering a civil war, economic collapse, or foreign invasion. This was the impossible challenge that Ashoka faced in 265 BCE, and his solution would create the world's first welfare state 2,000 years before anyone thought such a thing was possible. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Ashoka knew that announcing a complete reversal of Mauryan policy would trigger rebellions, military coups, and invasions from neighboring kingdoms who would interpret pacifism as weakness. Instead, he implemented what modern political scientists would recognize as a masterclass in gradual institutional change. The first step was redefining victory itself. Instead of measuring success through territories conquered and enemies killed, Ashoka introduced the concept of Dharma Vijaya, victory through righteousness. This wasn't just philosophical rhetoric, it was a complete restructuring of how the empire measured and rewarded achievement. Generals who had built careers on successful massacres were reassigned to infrastructure projects. The same organizational skills that had coordinated military campaigns were redirected toward building hospitals, schools, and roads. Warriors became engineers, and conquerors became administrators of public welfare. The policy changes were revolutionary in scope. Ashoka banned animal sacrifice in religious ceremonies, established the world's first animal welfare laws, and created protected reserves for wildlife. He restricted hunting for sport and regulated the meat trade to minimize animal suffering. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were enforced by imperial inspectors who had the authority to arrest violators. Even more radical was the establishment of free public hospitals. Not just for humans, but for animals as well. These medical centers provided treatment regardless of a patient's ability to pay, their social status, or even their species. Ashoka's medical corps treated injured war elephants with the same care they provided to injured humans. The infrastructure projects were staggering in scale. Ashoka ordered the construction of a road network spanning thousands of miles, connecting every major city in the empire. But these weren't military roads designed to move troops quickly. They were commercial highways lined with rest stops, wells, and medical stations for travelers. The most ambitious innovation was the creation of Dharma ministers, government officials whose only job was to ensure that imperial policies reduced suffering rather than increasing it. These ministers had the authority to overrule local governors if their decisions caused unnecessary harm to civilians. It was the world's first systematic attempt to build ethical oversight into government operations. Communication with citizens was revolutionized through the famous Edicts of Ashoka, inscriptions carved in stone and metal throughout the empire, written in local languages so that common people could read them directly. These weren't just policy announcements. They were philosophical treatises explaining why the government was changing and requesting voluntary cooperation from citizens. The edicts revealed something unprecedented: an emperor who publicly admitted his mistakes. Ashoka didn't try to justify the Kalinga massacre or pretend it had been necessary. Instead, he acknowledged that it had been a moral catastrophe and pledged that such atrocities would never happen again under his rule. This transparency created a new relationship between ruler and ruled. Citizens weren't just subjects who obeyed imperial commands, they were partners in a moral experiment that could reshape human civilization. Ashoka explicitly asked for their help in creating a society based on compassion rather than fear. The economic implications were enormous. Wars of conquest had provided a steady stream of tribute, slaves, and resources that financed imperial operations. Eliminating military expansion meant finding alternative revenue sources that didn't exploit conquered populations. Ashoka's solution was to invest in productivity rather than extraction. Agricultural innovations increased crop yields. Trade networks expanded commerce. Educational programs created skilled workers. Instead of extracting wealth from defeated enemies, the empire would generate prosperity through cooperation and development. The judicial system was completely reformed. Capital punishment was effectively abolished, with Ashoka personally reviewing every death sentence and commuting most to community service or rehabilitation programs. The principle was that criminals were sick rather than evil, and that society had an obligation to heal them rather than destroy them. Foreign policy became an exercise in what we would now call soft power. Instead of threatening neighbors with invasion, Ashoka sent ambassadors who offered technical assistance, cultural exchange, and economic cooperation. These Dharma ambassadors promoted voluntary adoption of ethical principles rather than imposing political domination. The results were mixed but remarkable. Some regions of the empire experienced unprecedented prosperity as resources previously devoted to warfare were redirected toward public welfare. Crime rates dropped in areas where social services addressed the root causes of desperation and violence. However, the experiment also faced serious challenges. Some neighboring kingdoms interpreted Mauryan pacifism as an opportunity for aggression. Border conflicts that would previously have been resolved through overwhelming military response now required complex diplomatic negotiations that didn't always succeed. Internal resistance came from multiple sources. Military leaders who had built careers on conquest felt marginalized by the new priorities. Wealthy merchants who had profited from war contracts lobbied against policies that reduced military spending. Religious conservatives opposed the emperor's tolerance for different faiths and philosophies. Most dangerously, some regional governors tested the limits of imperial nonviolence by implementing policies that directly contradicted Ashoka's reforms. When these officials faced criticism from Dharma ministers, they questioned whether a truly pacifist emperor would use force to remove them from office. Ashoka's response to these challenges defined the character of his transformation. Rather than abandoning his principles when they proved inconvenient, he developed increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining authority without resorting to violence. Economic incentives replaced military threats. Governors who implemented compassionate policies received increased funding and prestigious appointments. Those who clung to brutal methods found their resources redirected to more cooperative regions. Cultural influence became a tool of governance. The emperor's public embrace of Buddhism encouraged millions of citizens to adopt similar values voluntarily. Social pressure from converted populations often proved more effective than imperial commands in changing local behavior. Perhaps most importantly, Ashoka demonstrated that admitting mistakes could actually strengthen rather than weaken political authority. By acknowledging the failures of previous policies and showing genuine commitment to improvement, he earned a level of popular support that conquest alone had never achieved. The transformation of the Mauryan Empire represented humanity's first large-scale experiment in governing through compassion rather than fear. While it faced significant obstacles and wasn't universally successful, it proved that alternative approaches to power were possible even in a violent world. Can you imagine trying to run a government based on kindness in a world full of violence? Ashoka's experiment was unprecedented, and the results were both inspiring and challenging. If these radical reforms have amazed you, don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Tell us in the comments which of Ashoka's policies you think was most revolutionary for its time. In our final chapter, we'll discover the lasting impact of this incredible transformation and how it continues to influence the world today. When Emperor Ashoka died in 232 BCE, 36 years after the Kalinga massacre that had transformed him from history's greatest killer into its most devoted champion of peace, he left behind something unprecedented, proof that human beings were capable of radical moral transformation, even at the highest levels of power. The immediate aftermath of Ashoka's death revealed both the strength and fragility of his revolutionary experiment. His successors, lacking his personal commitment to non-violence, gradually abandoned many of his reforms. The Mauryan Empire itself collapsed within 50 years, unable to maintain its vast territories without the military aggression that Ashoka had renounced. But the ideas he had unleashed proved far more durable than the political structure that had contained them. Buddhism, which had been a relatively minor philosophical school when Ashoka converted, exploded across Asia in the centuries following his death. The missionaries he had sent to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia established communities that would preserve and develop his teachings for over 2 millennia. More importantly, these Buddhist communities carried with them practical knowledge about governance, medicine, and social organization that had been developed during Ashoka's reforms. The world's first hospitals, the concept of animal welfare laws, and the principle that governments should serve public welfare rather than elite interests. All of these innovations spread throughout Asia as part of Buddhist culture. The edicts of Ashoka, carved in stone and scattered across the Indian subcontinent, became time capsules that would eventually transform how humanity understood the possibilities of political power. For over 1,000 years after the Mauryan Empire fell, these inscriptions sat unread, their ancient scripts forgotten, and their messages lost to history. Then, in the 19th century, British archaeologists began deciphering the edicts and translating their contents. The discovery sent shockwaves through both the colonial administration and the emerging Indian independence movement. Here was documentary evidence that an Indian ruler had governed according to principles of compassion and non-violence centuries before European colonialism arrived. Mahatma Gandhi, leading India's struggle for independence, found in Ashoka's example a historical precedent for satyagraha, non-violent resistance to oppression. Gandhi argued that if an emperor commanding the world's largest army could renounce violence as a tool of governance, then independence activists could certainly defeat colonialism without resorting to terrorism or warfare. The influence extended far beyond India. When the newly independent nation adopted its national emblem in 1950, they chose Ashoka's lion capital, the sculpture that had topped his stone pillars. This wasn't just symbolic decoration, it represented a conscious decision to connect modern Indian democracy with Ashoka's experiment in ethical governance. The principles Ashoka had articulated spread through international law and human rights movements. His declaration that governments should protect the welfare of all citizens regardless of their religion, ethnicity, or social status became a foundational concept in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. The idea of truth and reconciliation processes used to heal societies after periods of mass violence drew inspiration from Ashoka's public acknowledgement of past atrocities and his commitment to preventing their repetition. From South Africa's post-apartheid reconciliation to Rwanda's Gacaca courts, elements of Ashoka's approach to addressing historical trauma can be traced through contemporary conflict resolution practices. Modern environmental movements, found in Ashoka's animal welfare laws and forest protection policies, an early example of governmental responsibility for ecological preservation. His recognition that human well-being was interconnected with the welfare of other species anticipated contemporary understanding of environmental interdependence by over 2,000 years. The field of public health also traces important precedents to Ashoka's medical innovations. His establishment of free hospitals, regardless of patients' ability to pay, became a model for universal healthcare systems that wouldn't be widely adopted in the West until the 20th century. Perhaps most significantly, Ashoka's transformation demonstrated that political power could be used for moral purposes without necessarily leading to weakness or collapse. While his immediate successors failed to maintain his empire, This was largely due to their abandonment of his principles rather than their failure. Contemporary neuroscience has provided insights into the psychological mechanisms that might have enabled Ashoka's transformation. Research on neuroplasticity demonstrates that human brains remain capable of fundamental change throughout life, and studies of moral injury among military veterans show patterns similar to what Ashoka appeared to experience after Kalinga. The concept of post-traumatic growth, the idea that traumatic experiences can sometimes lead to positive psychological changes, offers a framework for understanding how witnessing massive suffering could have triggered Ashoka's conversion to pacifism rather than simply hardening him further against compassion. Modern conflict resolution theory has embraced many principles that Ashoka pioneered. The importance of acknowledging harm, the power of moral authority, the effectiveness of non-violent pressure, and the necessity of addressing root causes rather than just symptoms of violence. International relations scholars study Ashoka's diplomatic innovations as early examples of soft power, the ability to achieve political objectives through attraction and persuasion rather than coercion. His Dharma ambassadors represented one of history's first systematic attempts to spread influence through cultural and moral appeal. The business world has discovered relevance in Ashoka's administrative reforms. His creation of ethical oversight positions anticipated modern corporate social responsibility programs, and his emphasis on stakeholder welfare over short-term profit maximization aligns with contemporary sustainable business practices. Educational institutions worldwide have incorporated Ashoka's story into curricula designed to develop ethical leadership. Business schools, military academies, and public policy programs use his transformation as a case study in the possibility of redemption and the power of moral courage. Yet Ashoka's legacy also includes sobering lessons about the limitations of individual transformation in changing institutional systems. His reforms were largely dependent on his personal authority and commitment. When he died, many reverted to previous practices. This suggests that sustainable change requires not just enlightened leadership, but also institutional structures that can maintain ethical practices across changes in personnel. The tension between idealism and pragmatism that characterized Ashoka's later reign remains relevant for contemporary leaders attempting to govern according to moral principles in a world where violence and exploitation remain common tools of statecraft. In our current era, as humanity faces global challenges that require unprecedented cooperation, climate change, pandemics, inequality, and the risk of technological disruption, Ashoka's example provides both inspiration and practical guidance. His demonstration that even the most powerful individuals can choose compassion over domination suggests that the fundamental changes necessary for human survival are psychologically possible. The emperor who killed 100,000 people and then spent the rest of his life trying to atone for that act created a legacy that continues to echo across millennia. His story proves that redemption is possible, that power can be used for moral purposes, and that individual transformation can have consequences that outlast empires and reshape civilizations. Most importantly, Ashoka's life demonstrates that the choice between creating suffering and alleviating it is always available, regardless of how far we may have fallen from our highest ideals. And so concludes the extraordinary story of history's greatest transformation, from humanity's most devastating killer to its most devoted champion of peace. If this tale of redemption and radical change has moved you, please subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of the incredible potential within every human soul. Like this video, share it with those who need to hear this message of hope and transformation, and tell us in the comments, do you believe such dramatic change is possible for world leaders today? Your engagement helps us continue exploring these timeless stories that prove the human capacity for growth, redemption, and moral courage knows no limits.